How does the wealthiest empire in human history bleed itself to death? Not through conquest by foreign armies, not through plague or natural disaster, but through something far more insidious, its own spending. This is the story of Rome, an empire that controlled the known world, commanded legions that never knew defeat, and built monuments that still stand today. Yet it destroyed itself with a financial crisis so catastrophic that it would take Europe 1,000 years to recover. At its peak, in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire was more than a political entity. It was an economic superpower that would dwarf most modern nations. Stretching from the fog-shrouded hills of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Mesopotamia, Rome governed over 50 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population at the time. Its cities pulsed with commerce. Rome itself housed over 1 million inhabitants, making it the largest city on Earth. Alexandria in Egypt rivaled it as a hub of trade and learning. Goods flowed along roads that connected 3 continents: grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, silk from China via the Parthian intermediaries, olive oil from Spain, and slaves from everywhere. But the true genius of Rome wasn't just conquest, it was systems. The empire created something unprecedented, a unified currency that worked across thousands of miles. The denarius, a silver coin weighing about 3.9 grams, became the dollar of the ancient world. In 100 AD, a single denarius could buy you a dozen eggs, a loaf of bread, or a liter of cheap wine. More importantly, it could pay a Roman legionary for a full day's work. The coin was trusted from Londinium to Jerusalem because it contained 95% pure silver. Merchants didn't need to test it, weigh it, or question it. It simply worked. This monetary stability wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Rome's imperial mints struck millions of denarii annually, each one a small guarantee of imperial power. When a soldier received his pay, 225 denarii per year for a legionary in the 1st century, he knew exactly what that money could buy, whether he spent it in Germania or Judea. This financial predictability enabled trade on a scale the world had never seen. A merchant in Antioch could sign a contract with a supplier in Gaul, confident that the payment would hold its value across the months it took to complete the transaction. The empire's revenue model was equally sophisticated. Rome didn't just tax its citizens, it built an extraction machine. Conquered provinces paid tribute, sometimes in precious metals, often in grain or goods. Egypt alone supplied Rome with enough wheat to feed the capital for 4 months every year, shipped across the Mediterranean in a logistical operation that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. Land taxes, sales taxes, inheritance taxes, customs duties. Rome had perfected the art of revenue collection centuries before the modern nation-state. The numbers were staggering. Historians estimate that at its height, Rome collected approximately 825 million sesterces annually in tax revenue. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 206 million denarii, enough to pay 183,000 legionaries for an entire year. And Rome had exactly that many soldiers at its peak, spread across 30 legions and auxiliary units, manning forts from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates River. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. That massive army wasn't just for show, it was expensive beyond anything the ancient world had ever seen before. A single legion required about 1.2 million denarii annually just for wages. Add equipment, food, fortifications, roads, transport, and support staff, and the cost more than doubled. By the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the 120s AD, imperial spending consumed an estimated 70 to 80% of the imperial budget. Think about that. 4 out of every 5 denarii Rome collected went straight.
Some emperors tried to fix it. Emperor Diocletian, who took power in 284 AD, was perhaps the most competent financial manager Rome had seen in a century. He reformed the tax system, stabilized the army, and introduced a new currency. His famous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD attempted to freeze prices across the entire empire, fixing bread at 2 denarii, wine at 16 denarii per liter, a teacher's salary at 200 denarii per month. It was the Roman equivalent of wage and price controls, and it failed spectacularly. You cannot legislate away inflation. Black markets exploded. Merchants hid goods rather than sell at a loss. The edict became unenforceable within months. The fundamental problem was structural. Rome had built a military machine that required 400,000 soldiers by the 4th century, nearly double the force of 2 centuries earlier. Each soldier cost more to equip, train, and pay. Fortifications grew more elaborate and expensive. Civil wars, fought every few decades over imperial succession, destroyed wealth and diverted resources. Emperor Constantine's war against Maxentius in 312 AD cost an estimated 300 million numai in military expenses alone. That's money that could have fed Rome's population for 3 years. And here's the kicker. Rome knew it was happening. Ancient writers documented it in real time. Cassius Dio, a senator and historian writing in the early 3rd century, explicitly blamed military overspending and currency debasement for the empire's troubles. Cyprian, a Christian bishop in the 250s, described fields abandoned, mines exhausted, and farmers fleeing to cities. They saw the collapse coming, but the political will to fix it never materialized. Why? Because cutting the military meant risking invasion, raising taxes meant risking rebellion, reforming the currency meant angering the army. Every solution was politically impossible, so emperors kicked the can down the road and hoped their successor would deal with it. The parallels to today are uncomfortable. Modern nations face similar traps: ballooning military budgets, rising debt, and political gridlock that prevents reform. The United States spends over $800 billion annually on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined. National debt exceeds $34 trillion. Does that guarantee collapse? No, modern economies are far more complex and resilient than Rome's, but the warning is clear. Empires that spend beyond their means, that rely on borrowing and monetary manipulation to fund unsustainable commitments, eventually face a reckoning. Rome's final act stretched over 200 years, but the financial architecture that enabled its greatness had collapsed by the 4th century. The Western Roman Empire limped along until 476 AD, when the last emperor was deposed by a Germanic chieftain, but the empire had effectively died a century earlier, hollowed out by inflation, debt, and military overreach. What's the lesson? Wealth without discipline is temporary. Power without sustainability is an illusion. Rome conquered the world but couldn't conquer its own appetite for spending. It defeated Carthage, crushed the Gauls, and humbled Parthia, but it couldn't defeat basic mathematics. When revenue can't keep pace with expenses, when currency loses meaning, when soldiers cost more than the empire can afford to pay, collapse isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The Roman Empire fell not because it was weak, but because it was expensive. It proves that you can build the greatest civilization in history, command the loyalty of millions, and still destroy yourself with a spreadsheet. Rome didn't fall to barbarians, it fell to its own budget. And that's a lesson every empire, every nation, and every government would be wise to remember before the coins turn to dust and the legions march home on.
Why? Because Rome had built an empire it couldn't afford to defend. Every border required legions. Every legion needed roads, forts, and supply chains. The Rhine-Danube frontier alone stretched 2,500 miles and required 14 legions, over 75,000 professional soldiers, just to hold the line against Germanic tribes. The eastern frontier, facing Parthia, demanded another 8 legions. Britain, that cold, rebellious province that contributed relatively little economically, tied down 3 entire legions for centuries. The mathematics of empire were brutal. Rome needed constant revenue to pay for constant defense, and the only way to get more revenue was to conquer more territory, which required more soldiers, which cost more money, which required more conquests. It was a treadmill, and Rome couldn't step off. For a while, the system worked. Rome's conquests under Trajan in the early 2nd century brought in enormous wealth. His campaigns in Dacia, modern-day Romania, seized gold and silver mines that flooded the treasury with 165,000 kilograms of gold and 331,000 kilograms of silver. It was the largest windfall in Roman history. Trajan used it to fund his grand building projects, expand the army, and launch an invasion of Parthia. But there was a problem. Dacia was the last major conquest. After Trajan, there were no more wealthy kingdoms left to plunder within reasonable reach. The expansion stopped, the revenue boost ended, but the expenses, those kept growing. Enter the death spiral. When emperors could no longer conquer their way to solvency, they turned to the one tool they had left: currency manipulation. It started subtly. Under Emperor Nero in the 60s AD, the silver content of the denarius dropped from 95% to 93%. Most people didn't notice. A few decades later, under the Severan dynasty in the early 3rd century, it fell to 50%. By 270 AD, under Emperor Aurelian, the denarius was barely 5% silver, essentially a copper coin with a silver wash. This wasn't just inflation, this was monetary collapse. A loaf of bread that cost half a denarius in 100 AD cost 4 denarii by 250 AD. By 301 AD, when Emperor Diocletian tried to impose price controls, that same loaf officially cost 200 denarii, but black market prices were even higher. Soldiers who once earned 225 denarii per year now earned 3,600, but their purchasing power had fallen by 90%. Imagine your paycheck increasing 16-fold while your rent goes up 100-fold. That was life in 3rd century Rome. The human cost was devastating. Meet Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, not the famous emperor, but an ordinary Egyptian farmer whose tax records survived on papyrus. In 200 AD, Marcus paid 12 drachmas in annual land tax, manageable for his small farm. By 250 AD, his grandson paid 480 drachmas for the same land. The farm hadn't grown, the harvest hadn't improved, but the tax burden had increased 40-fold while the currency had collapsed. The result? Abandonment. Archaeological evidence shows that farmland across the empire was simply deserted in the 3rd century. Farmers walked away because no amount of labor could pay the tax bill. The military felt it too. Legions that once prided themselves on discipline began mutinying for higher pay. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had over 50 emperors, most lasting less than 2 years. Most died violently, killed by their own soldiers who were promised bonuses that never came. The imperial throne became a death sentence, and the empire's finances spiraled into chaos.